Hi guys, today I'll show you how I transformed these simple nightstands into more of a modern boho style. I bought these two nightstands from Facebook Marketplace from a hotel furniture reseller for $40. As you can see, they have some water damage on the top, but other than that, they were in really good conditions. They had some exposed wood on the legs, which made me think it was a solid wood piece. Before starting, I cleaned them with soap and water since they had been outside for a while and had accumulated quite a bit of dust. Once clean, I went ahead and removed the hardware. I recommend saving the loose pieces in a Ziploc bag to ensure you don't lose them. Originally, I was only going to remove the hardware, but you'll see later on, I end up removing the drawers and the slides for the ease of the project. The next step was to remove the paint. To see what type of wood I was working with, I used the Klean-Strip's Premium Paint Remover and Stripper. I have found this product to give the best results. Once the recommended 15 minutes have passed, you'll start to see the paint bubble up and come off. I use a flex scraper to remove the paint stripper off. This chemical will burn your hands, so it's very important to use gloves and be in a well-ventilated area. This process is repeated along the entire piece. I use Klean-Strip Mineral Spirit to clean off and stop the chemical reaction of the stripper. Make sure you use gloves when using mineral spirits. This could also burn your hands. Here's what I found under the paint. Unfortunately, the wood on the legs was not the same material used throughout the entire piece. As you can see, the drawers, top, and side were made out of this compressed wood, and the water damage seemed to be a little bit more than I expected. I originally wanted to bring this piece to its natural wood and give it some kind of stain. But with this discovery, I changed directions and I decided to paint them and give them the boho look they have. In order to remove the water damaged areas, I needed to sand them until they were smooth. I used a 220 grit sandpaper. I didn't want to use a 120 or an 80 grit sandpaper because I didn't want to damage the particle board more than it already was. If this would have been solid wood, then I would have used a lower grit. When I was done sanding, I made sure to clean the piece with water just to remove any dust residue. As you can tell, the water damaged areas look very different from the rest of the piece. The camera doesn't quite capture this, but the surface is nice and smooth and you can't feel the water damage anymore. This is so important before moving forward. If there are any bumps in the surface, when you start to paint, they will be very noticeable. I use Bull's Eye's Shellac Clear to protect the exposed areas that had previous water damage. This will give a protective coat and allow it to be sealed from further water damage. Once the shellac was dried, I used a 400 grit sandpaper to remove any slight imperfections it might have had. Then I cleaned the dust particles with a little bit of water. We are ready to paint. To start off, I used an all-purpose water-based primer and applied an even coat throughout the entire nightstand. After the primer was dried and before applying the first coat of paint, I lightly sanded with a 220 grit sandpaper. This is just to ensure that the surface is nice and smooth from layer to layer. If not, the roughness will continue to show each time you apply another coat. The color I use for this piece is Bare Aged Beige in an eggshell finish. I applied 2 even and thin layers, slightly sanding in between each layer with the 220 grit sandpaper, and cleaning the dust off with a wet rag. To seal the piece, I used the Varathane water-based polyurethane with a satin finish. Similar to the layers of paint, I lightly sanded and cleaned the piece before applying the polyurethane. I applied 2 layers on the drawers and the sides, and then a third layer on the top of the nightstand, since this is a highly used area. I wanted to apply a stencil to the drawers of the nightstand. The stencil I chose didn't fit the entire drawer, so I decided to pencil in a couple of options. The first option, I lined the stencil close to the handles. The second option, I started from the edge of the drawer on each side. I felt this was a little too far apart, so I went with the first option. It seemed to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. To apply the stencil, I used FolkArt Metallic Antique Gold color, some blue tape, a sponge, and the stencil itself. I used stencil number 1926344 from Hobby Lobby. I've never applied a stencil before, so this was a bit of a trial and error. I used a screw as a guide to ensure the distance on each side was the exact same. Then I applied some blue tape on the sides to ensure the stencil didn't move. The first attempt, I saturated the sponge and applied paint on each area until the desired color was reached. When I removed the stencil, the paint had bled under the stencil and did not look good at all. Here's a close-up. I ended up wiping this off. The next idea I had was to try spray paint. I used a black color I had on hand over a piece of cardboard. It looked way better, but it was not the full rich color I was looking for. I didn't record this process. Sorry guys, but you can see the black paint I used. Finally, I decided to do a little bit more research on how to properly apply stencil onto furniture. Let's be honest, I probably should have done this in the first place. The recommendation is to apply a little bit of amount of paint on multiple layers until the desired color is reached. When I removed the stencil, I was pleasantly surprised. This technique worked like a charm. I had some paint residue from the stencil that wasn't fully cleaned. I just simply used a wet rag and wiped it off. Once it was fully dried, I applied the first layer of polyurethane to the drawer. I decided to use the same hardware that was already on the nightstands. However, I wanted to change them to the same antique gold I used for the stencil. I cleaned the handles with soap and water and gave them a good sanding with 120 grit sandpaper so that the paint would adhere to the metal. I did a couple of layers of the FolkArt paint. Then, when I was cleaning them to spray on the layer of polyurethane, the paint started coming off. I was so sad. So I went on to plan B. I went to Home Depot and bought a can of Rust-Oleum metallic spray paint. I looked for the color that was closest to the antique gold I used for the stencil. I applied a couple of light layers until the handle was fully covered. This technique worked really well. After a handful of trial and errors, I was finally ready to start rebuilding the nightstands. I first added the drawer slides, made sure that they were leveled. Once both sides were installed, I added the drawers. First nightstand worked like a charm. The second one, I installed the drawer slides uneven, so when I tried to close the drawer, it wouldn't fully close. So, went back and reinstalled them correctly. Once this mistake was corrected, all that was pending was adding the handles back onto the drawers. And here we go. We went from this to this. Tell me what you think. I'll add a list of supplies and links of the products I used for this project in the description. Please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, here at Angie's Crafts Furniture Renovation.